Greetings, Internet. Welcome to another episode of Deploy Friday, the Platform SH web show where we talk with interesting people about cool topics, or sometimes cool people about interesting topics. That was backwards. You know what I mean. Today, we're continuing our language spotlight series with Ruby, another web language that runs on Platform SH. And we're joined today by a couple of guests. We first have Emily Giurleo. Did I get that right?
Not quite, but almost.
All right, I'm trying here. And Jason Charnes. And from the Platform SH side, we're joined by one of our support engineers, Afote Kwe. So before we get into talking about Ruby, Emily, tell us a little bit about you. Who are you? What do you do? What are you doing here?
Sure thing. My name is Emily Giurleo. I am a Ruby developer and have been developing with Ruby for about 3.5 years. And I currently work at MongoDB on the Ruby driver. So my job is maintaining two pretty big open source Ruby libraries. And yeah, I love the Ruby language and I'm here to talk about it.
Cool. Jason, how about you?
Hey, yeah, I have been writing Ruby going on 9 years now. I mostly work in Rails, but Rails inspired my love for Ruby. So since then, I've tried to only do Ruby professionally up to now. And yeah, glad to be here. Thanks for letting me come talk Ruby.
Now, you only want to do Ruby professionally, and that's the only language you want to use when doing professional stuff, or you only want to use it if you're doing professional stuff?
Yeah, I probably worded that weird. I just really enjoy it. So when I got into it, that's all I wanted to do. Now I have my sights set on other languages, but still happy writing Ruby at work. So.
It's okay to have a favorite language as long as you are aware of others, which is
Totally.
kind of the reason we're here. So it's a good segue, actually. So there's lots of languages on the market. A lot of us have worked in a number of different languages. What is it that makes Ruby special as a language, that makes it unique or worth looking at Ruby in particular?
For me, when I first got started in programming, I was mostly front end. And so I got real frustrated that I couldn't make things happen on the server. So I segued into PHP, but this was, early 2010. And I just had trouble kind of grasping all the web dev server-side concepts. And I found Rails, which isn't, it's Ruby. It's a more specific part of Ruby, but it was, it was the first time everything clicked for me, because Rails, abstracts so much that I was able to understand the concepts. But even more than that, Ruby was really easy to understand while I was learning all these concepts. It just simplified things for me, because the syntax kind of just doesn't really get in your way. And so that really just sparked my love of programming, took it to a next level. So for me, I think Ruby is special because just of the joy I get writing it. It's syntactically very user-friendly.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And, just before we started streaming, we were talking about RubyConf last year, and Yukihiro Maksumoto, who we call Mats, he is kind of the father of the Ruby programming language. He said Ruby sparks programming joy, and I think that's a really apt way to put it. It's really fun and really satisfying to write Ruby, and I think it makes people want to program, just like Jason said.
Nice. Now, Jason, you said you started with not just Ruby, but Rails in particular. For an awful lot of people, the idea of the word Ruby without on Rails after it just feels kind of weird. I know, Ruby on Rails, the framework was when Ruby really took off and entered the common lexicon of in the development world. Is that still the case? Is the Ruby community still a 90% Rails ecosystem, or is there more going on there than just the Rails world? And what is that?
For me, my life very much still revolves around Rails. I know there's a lot of people using Ruby, or at least we're using Ruby like for DevOps, you know, kind of early on. I know that's even kind of shifted into languages like Go and things like that. There's also there's a lot of cool stuff happening in a couple of other frameworks in Ruby. They're just not near it. Web frameworks are just not near as popular as Rails. Framework like Hanami is a web framework that's up and coming. So there's a lot of movement, but yeah, Rails is still very much when you hear Ruby, a lot of people just think, oh, Ruby and Rails, that's the same thing.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think there are obviously examples of people using Ruby without Rails. For example, like Homebrew is written in Ruby. I think that's a great example of a program that just uses straight up Ruby. And I think Ruby is a great language for scripting and just like writing little programs that if you need help doing like logistical stuff or whatever. But what we see with people who use, for example, like our gems at MongoDB, there are some people who use just the Ruby driver without like Rails, but a lot of people are using it with Rails primarily.
Okay. Other than Hanami, are there other non-Rails frameworks worth looking at if you want something more lightweight? Or perhaps less opinionated, since Rails is a famously opinionated framework, which is not a dig. Opinionated frameworks absolutely have their advantages.
A couple that I know of, I mean, Sinatra is kind of the other like popular web framework, and it's very much the polar opposite of Rails. It's very lightweight. The first time I ever worked on a Sinatra app, I basically tried to reinvent Rails with it, and that's when I was like, maybe I don't know what I'm doing. And there's a couple of kind of like API specific frameworks. There's one called Grape that is pretty popular, and there's some more. Sinatra, Hanami, and Rails are the three that I'm at least the most familiar with.
Okay.
I also think like Rails can be a bit more flexible than we give it credit for. Like I've been using Rails a lot as API only apps. So like no front end and just serve like a JSON REST API. And so I think the Rails maintainers are doing a really awesome job of listening to the community and sort of like breaking apart the bits and pieces that could be useful on their own.
Okay, that's good to hear. So Ruby is also, as I understand it, one of the very few languages that has multiple viable implementations. Most languages have a single implementation, a single compiler, a single runtime, and that's it. Ruby doesn't. How does that work out in practice? Are the different, what are the big implementations? How do they differ? Do they differ?
Yeah, they definitely do differ. And I will tell you that because I have to maintain gems that work on many of them. The two big ones are Ruby MRI. MRI stands for Matz's Ruby implementation. Matz is the computer scientist who invented Ruby, and that's written in C. And then the other big one I would say is JRuby, which is Ruby written in Java. And they have like basically the same APIs externally, so you can, for most cases, use them interchangeably. But because they are implemented differently, they have some different kind of side effects and features. So JRuby, for example, is truly multi-threaded. So if you're trying to create a multi-threaded application, JRuby is a great version of Ruby to use. MRI is not technically multi-threaded, but it has a global interpreter lock, meaning that you can technically create threads, and it's helpful if you have an IO bound application, because you can like set a thread to wait for a response from IO while another thread goes off and does some other stuff. So multi-threading is a big area where the Ruby implementations differ.
So with MRI, it ends up running more akin to how a Node app would run, with a lot of things being async, even if the syntax for it is designed to look more thread-like?
I can't really speak to Node, but it is not actually running multiple like processes or anything. Yeah.
Okay, but like if I'm writing an application in Ruby, I usually don't need to worry about am I writing for MRI or JRuby, it's going to be compatible either way, unless I'm doing deep driver stuff like you are.
Unless you're doing, yeah, unless you're doing, like there are some gotchas where it's like, oh, this particular method doesn't take this one argument in JRuby, but like almost always they are identical, just if you're looking at them externally.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do they both get new releases at the same time when new language versions come out, or?
No, as far as I know, they're maintained separately. And so they're like, they have different versioning schemes. They're both being actively maintained and releasing new versions, but not necessarily with the same features at the same time. Jason, I don't know if you have like more insight on that.
Excuse me. I've actually never used JRuby. I've always watched it from afar. So I don't have a lot to speak on there. The other one I mentioned that's caught my eye is Truffle Ruby. I don't know enough about the specifics of it, but Chris Seaton was working on it, and it's built on the Graal virtual machine, and it's a project app that started out of Oracle, and it's supposed to run Ruby like a tremendous amount like quicker, and I know they're still putting a lot of work in it, but there's a lot of people already running like their gems, their packages. They're running tests also against Truffle just to make sure that it's running correctly. So that's what I have my eye on, but I don't know enough about it to explain all the technical differences.
That's cool. I hadn't heard of that one. I'm gonna look into that.
We'll definitely add all of these to the show notes so people can follow up with those.
And one of the neat things about that one, because we talked to Chris on an episode of the Remote Ruby podcast, and a lot of other languages are also implemented on this VM. So like I think there's like a version of Python, and the idea, there's this like concept that you can actually call code from other packages in other languages because they're all in the same VM. And it was like mind-blowing, and Chris is really smart, and I just kind of was like, I don't understand half of this, but this sounds amazing. So
yeah,
That's
one of the
awesome.
advantages of having a common runtime VM like that. And that's like the JVM does the same thing. That's how you can get things like JRuby written on that VM. So yeah, that's a nice trick if you can pull it off, but it's not easy.
Yeah. So I had a question. So I am one of these people. A lot of boot camps have used Ruby and Rails to introduce people to coding. So that was kind of the experience that I had and that I've come from. But I know in the last few years, Ruby has kind of lost some ground on this front to Python and JavaScript. There's languages like that. Do you still recommend Ruby for people who are learning like this? And if so, what kind of advice do you have for people who are either starting to use Ruby as their first language or thinking about starting to use Ruby as a first language or maybe as a second language?
That's a great question, and I guess I like question the premise of the question of your question a little bit, because it kind of makes it sound like, oh, if you're picking this first language, then you're like locked in for life and you have to be a Rubyist forever. But I think that's absolutely not the case, and I definitely look at programming languages as tools. And so if you only have one tool in your tool belt, then you're like, I have to solve all my problems with this one tool. And that's like, if you tried to fix a toilet with a hammer, that would not work and you'd be really sad about it. So I would instead just look at it as like, no matter what programming language you're starting out with, you are just adding that tool to your tool belt. I think Ruby is a great tool to start out with because, like we said, the syntax is really straightforward. It's designed to create joy when you're programming and to make it feel really simple and intuitive. And so I think that's a great kind of on-ramp to things that might be might have like a steeper learning curve. But at the end of the day, all you've done by learning Ruby is just you just have that tool in your tool belt for problems that are well suited to Ruby. Jason, I don't know what you think.
No, that's a really good point. Because it is very easy, especially when you're starting off, to feel like I'm investing all my time in this. Like this is the only thing I'll know how to do. And that like it's kind of like just a gateway into whatever language you choose is a gateway just into programming. So I'm biased because like my start was with Rails, and because it was so opinionated, it helped me not have to ask questions about like SQL or like middleware and things like that. Like when I got started, because Rails was like, we handle a lot of that for you. So it helped me ramp up quicker. And then when I was comfortable, go back and learn those concepts at a deeper level. And so for Rails and Ruby, like because both of those things just kind of get out of the way, that is very much a reason for me to encourage people to do that. At the same time, one thing that I'd really like in the Ruby community to improve is the number of junior-friendly jobs. And that is one of the things that does make it a little difficult to tell people to learn Rails. I have a friend who just left a career to become a programmer. He did a Rails boot camp. He really struggled to find a Rails job because he had no programming experience before, and a lot of Ruby jobs want mid-level senior.
Yeah. It
seems a little bit easier in JavaScript. I'm not familiar with the Python community as much, but it seems a lot easier. Maybe it's not the right word, but there's more junior jobs accessible in JavaScript. So that makes it tough. But in terms of just learning, yeah, like Rails makes you feel really powerful really quickly, and I think there's something to be said in Ruby too. So
yeah,
yep. I definitely have seen that in.
Absolutely. I mean that is definitely.
Go ahead, Afote.
I was just going to say, I mean that was my experience. You know, kind of what you both spoke to. I mean, just starting off, I was able to ramp up very easily, and since then, yeah, I mean, I've definitely added other languages to my tool belt. So it wasn't, you know, not so much a matter of, you know, yeah, you're going to be locked into this ecosystem. This is the only thing you're ever going to need, ever going to learn. But you know, it's a great place to start. And you know, and again, for me, I branched out into PHP, JavaScript. I've done some other languages since then, and but you know, some of those base concepts I learned in Ruby definitely helped me to pick up with developing applications in those other languages. So
yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And to Jason's point, I've definitely seen that, you know, you can either start with the basics and not know what you're doing and not be able to produce anything, or you can start with something that does have to work for you, but then you're not learning the basics. And figuring out how to balance that in the process of learning to program is a real challenge, regardless of the language or framework you're using. I would encourage anyone who has gotten started in a beginner-friendly framework, whether that's Ruby on Rails, or whether that's Laravel, whether that's, I don't know what the equivalent would be over on the Python or Node side. You know, once you're comfortable in there, take it away and learn how to build that yourself. Not because you're actually going to write your own framework. Please don't do that. But you know, learning what goes on under that hood is super valuable for knowing how to use the tools effectively. But it's definitely a multi-stage process. So.
Yeah, and one thing I'll add to that, which kind of helped my decision to choose Ruby, was I was in a advanced algorithms and data structure class in college, which used Java, and like we were learning about like linked lists, right? And I was like, how do you do this in Ruby? And like every article that came up on Google was like, yeah, don't worry about doing this in Ruby. Here's like all the abstractions around it and stuff. And it just like, it made me feel like, okay, you're handling some of these. I'm sure lots of languages have that same thing, like, but it just kind of made me feel more comfortable using a language that's like thought about certain abstractions and stuff. And it's like, don't worry about the low level details right now.
Yeah, I think if there's one thing to be said about the Ruby community, it's that they love solved problems. Like once someone has done something and they've done it well, it's like, all right, make it a gem. Everyone uses that gem. we're moving on. We've done that already.
As a PHP developer, I very much appreciate that approach. we like to reinvent things. So one of the kind of part of the mythos around Ruby is, you said it's a very beginner-friendly language. It makes it fun to learn in part because once you get a feel for it, it's not surprising that everything kind of fits together nicely. How accurate is that? And are there things that still surprise you in Ruby, either syntactically or stylistically or ecosystem-wise?
In Ruby, not as much. The Ruby language, I mean, you kind of spoke to it. Like once you're familiar with it, I think they call it like the principle of least surprise is a term like I've heard thrown around at like Ruby and Rails comps. And that really is very much the case. Like there's few things about Ruby that surprise me. I mean, I guess I'm always surprised how easy it is to make a mess. Like with because it is so flexible, like metaprogramming, monkey patching, like DHH uses the phrase like Ruby gives you sharp knives. And like if you're trained, you know how to use them. If not, you can like cut your fingers off.
Nice analogy.
It's pretty apt. So Ruby doesn't surprise me as much. Rails does surprise me a lot of the times because it does so many things for you. A lot of things in active records still, like even last night, I was getting some deep stuff and I was like banging my head against my desk. But that's more of a framework than the actual language. So.
Yeah, I can't say that very much Ruby surprises me, not because I'm like an expert or anything, but I think just because I think it's designed that way, and I think they have done it well.
Nice. Yeah, so what would you say is your like favorite feature of Ruby compared to other languages you've worked with? I mean, at this point, you've all worked with multiple languages. What stands out like, this is a cool feature in Ruby that no one else has or other people need to copy?
One thing that Jason mentioned, I don't know if other people need to copy this, but Ruby metaprogramming. And yeah, just like for anyone who might not be familiar with this concept, I read an article that explained it really well the other day, which is like most code modifies data, but metaprogramming is when you write code to modify code. And so it's like you change the behavior of your program at runtime. You can, create new methods, change the behavior of existing methods, stuff like that. And I think it encourages you, when appropriately used, it encourages you to get really creative and to also like understand how the gems and libraries you're working with actually behave, and then like understand the design of them, the architecture of them, and figure out like the best way to make your small modifications to the program that like will accomplish your goal. I don't think it is a blanket solution for everything. It is a sharp knife, I agree. But I think like when there's an opportunity to do some metaprogramming, like that's when it gets really fun.
For sufficiently scary definitions of fun.
Yeah.
My favorite thing, I guess, about Ruby isn't necessarily specific to Ruby, but like its flexibility in terms of like Ruby is very unashamedly an object-oriented language, like from the ground up. Like most types in Ruby are actually objects themselves, like an integer is an object, a string is an object. But it just because it's very object-oriented doesn't mean that it doesn't have some like very good functional concepts built in. And like, a few years back, kind of with like the rise of, at least in the Ruby community, people talking about Elixir, that very much piqued my interest in functional programming, but I didn't necessarily want to leave Ruby. And so like I was able to learn some of those concepts, and there's a lot of really good ways to apply them in Ruby. Like Ruby's enumerable functionality, so like working with collections is wonderful. And it's so easy to like chain those together and like take a list and just transform it. Things like lambdas and procs allow you to like essentially pass functions around almost. And it's just like, you know, for an object-oriented language, that's really cool that you can kind of blend the two things together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm a big fan of, you know, functional programming and object-oriented programming are not at odds with each other. And if done right, they can complement each other really, really well. I've done some of that work over on the PHP side, and I find that combination, again, when done well, really, really powerful. So it's good to hear that Ruby has that same movement in it, and I'm looking forward to seeing more of that.
Yeah, and the Hanami framework I mentioned is very much moving towards one of those blended approaches of functional and object-oriented.
Nice.
There's a set of packages under this umbrella called JRuby, and it's very much a bunch of small packages that really kind of apply some of these functional concepts. And two of the core members of JRuby are actually working with the Hanami creator, like to build the second version of Hanami. And so it's really fascinating, and I really look forward to in the coming years like doing more of that.
That sounds like my kind of framework. If I decide to dig into Ruby, I'll have to look at Hanami instead of at Rails.
So, you know, I mean, and coming on the back of that discussion of the very cool things that you can do with Ruby, a thing I was interested in for the both of you is what is the most interesting thing that you've seen done with Ruby, or that you've actually done yourself with Ruby?
I don't really think I've done a lot of interesting things. I feel like I've not like reinvented any wheels. One of the things that I still am so fascinated by, it's not a project that is as popular as maybe it once was. There's a project called Ruby Motion, and it allows you to write like native iOS, Android, and OS X apps in Ruby. And what it does is it like you write just Ruby code, and it actually does the hard work of compiling it down to Objective-C, I think, or some. I haven't kept up with it in a while. I was always really fascinated by that. The problem with me for that is I always found the iOS, like the Apple frameworks, difficult to wrap my head around. And so, like, even though you're writing Ruby, you still have to understand like how that world works. But I always thought that was so fascinating and a really cool project.
Interesting. So is it a transpiler, or there's a Ruby runtime embedded in the app that runs on the phone?
I believe it's a transpiler.
Very cool.
Yeah, I wrote a few years back at a hackathon here in Memphis. I wrote like an app with it, and there were some really cool gems, some packages for iOS and Ruby Motion. And so it almost felt like cheating because the syntax was like, you know, it was metaprogramming, and it was things like you want some text here on the screen, you just be like, call a method text with the text, and like it would put it there in an app, and you're like, whoa, this is magic. A lot of that for me got replaced by like React Native, but I don't know, the fact that it was in Ruby, it still just blows my mind. Those, like, when I think of two languages that are polar opposite, like Objective-C and Ruby, like they just feel so far apart.
I don't know even how you would transpile that. I'm shocked.
It's mind-boggling. There's a developer who wrote this app that was really famous. It was called A Dark Room, and it was a game for iOS, and it was written with Ruby Motion. And the company who was kind of leading the charge of Ruby Motion ended up selling him Ruby Motion, like the whole thing, the whole branding, all of it around it. And so he's done some really cool things with it. He's working on a thing called Dragon Ruby, which is like a game engine because, well, he had a really successful game. So it makes sense. Yeah, it's not game, like building games is everything I've been interested in, but it's just, yeah, it's neat.
That's really cool. I had never heard of that.
Yeah.
I'm having trouble thinking of the coolest thing I've ever seen. I mean, I think like people in the Ruby community are always doing very like random, interesting stuff. Like at RubyConf last year, there were people talking about like, you know, running a really like small light version of Ruby on like microcomputers and stuff like that. So I think the Ruby community is always thinking of like, where can we put Ruby next? Like not for any like particularly useful reason, but just because there's like a lot of creativity and curiosity there. So I think it's an awesome community.
So how much of Ruby is non-web these days?
I don't know if I could give you a number.
I feel like I'm such a bad judge of that because my entire life is web development. So for me, it's 100%, but is web development. But I know there's a lot of people still there. I think they're less vocal than like web developers. But like in the Ruby Reddit, when people talk about like Rails is synonymous with Ruby, like people always kind of like come out of the woodwork. Like I use Ruby for this. I don't write web apps, and so
Okay.
yeah.
There is a big chunk of the community that's doing non-web stuff.
There is, yeah.
Yeah, I would say like I mean I don't do any web development at work, and one of the gems I'm working on is like primarily for people who probably don't do a ton of web development. So I think there's a lot of like just server side specifically or other non-web applications that are maybe slightly less like flashy than all of the web output, and maybe slightly less popular, and so they don't get as much love on Stack Overflow or Reddit or other sites where people go to talk about these things.
What?
Yeah, I know. Wasn't it Vagrant used Ruby as its a config file format? That's one of the things that Ruby is good at, as I understand that it's a number of applications use Ruby as a config file format because it looks so config-ish and yet it's still a full programming language. So does anyone do that besides Vagrant? It's the only one I'm familiar with that does that, but I've heard others do.
Not that I know of. I don't know if you've heard of anything like that, Jason.
No. What in Laravel is that Homestead that is like it like helps configure an environment for you. Is that in Vagrant? Do you know?
I think it's it was a Vagrant extension at one point. I'm not sure.
Okay.
If I haven't kept up with it.
Okay, because that's the only project I really know of. Because the only reason I know that is one of the maintainers lives here in Memphis, and I remember him asking us Ruby questions one time, and I was like, "You are like a PHP advocate. What is happening right now?" And then he was like, "Oh, I help maintain Homestead." And so,
yeah, I know who you're talking about. He's a really nice guy, and I'm blanking on his name right now.
Joe Ferguson.
What's that?
Joe Ferguson.
Joe Ferguson. Joe, my apologies. But yeah, it's an interesting balance there because he's writing a Ruby app to support a PHP app.
Right. Yeah. That's the only one I really know of. I did. Emily said something about like people are trying to put Ruby like wherever they can, and a project I did want to mention is actually mRuby, and it is a like official like Ruby like official Ruby project. Matt actually works on mRuby too, and the M is, if I'm not mistaken, for like embedded Ruby, and so it's like a smaller version of Ruby that, if I understand it correctly, that people are trying to put on like devices and things like that. It's really fascinating.
Devices like phones or devices like watches and light bulbs?
My assumption is the latter, like things like Like if I had a Raspberry Pi or something, I wanted to like
Yep, exactly.
put Ruby on it. Yeah.
Okay. So not quite full IoT stuff like light bulbs or refrigerators, but the one step up from there.
I think like working in that direction.
Yeah. Okay. That'd be fascinating.
Yeah, and Ruby, thanks for remembering the name. I do not remember it.
Mm-hmm. So is that just a very optimized Ruby, or does it strip out some functionality?
I'm kind of ignorant. I believe it strips out some functionality.
Okay.
I've got the GitHub pulled up here, and it says that it's also able to generate compiled bytecode in a C source file. So I think in order to do things like that, it probably does have to strip out some of the things Ruby has.
Yeah.
So then is it transpiling to C?
I don't know. That's a good question. Let's see here. It just says it's a thing you can do. mRuby can be linked and embedded within your application. We provide the interpreter program in Ruby, but you can also compile it using the mRuby compiler. So.
Fascinating. I did not expect a scripting language like that to be that transpiling friendly.
I don't think it is. So, but I do know.
Relative.
Yeah, I do know that. I know from what I understand, Mats actually puts a lot of time into mRuby, and one of the things I've heard, I've never really experienced this myself, but Mats is from Japan, and Ruby is actually very popular in Japan outside of web development, from what I've heard. And so like a lot of like the use cases for Ruby outside of Rails are happening in Japan. And I would love to learn more about it. I've just never taken the time to.
If any of our listeners are in Japan or familiar with that market, let us know. That would be interesting to talk about.
Absolutely.
For sure.
There's a world beyond web, even if it doesn't sound like it coming from a web hosting company. But
so we've got Ruby 3.0 coming down the pipeline. What is coming in the next release? And out of those things, what are you the most excited about?
One thing that the Ruby maintainers have been working on that I'm really excited about is memory compaction, which is maybe like kind of a boring topic, but bear with me. So, historically, I think like one of the big like boogeyman myths about Ruby is that it is prone to memory leaks and memory bloat, and don't use it if you really need like a performant application. And so I think the maintainers have been doing a lot to address this. In Ruby 2.7, which is the version they released last winter, they introduced a manual memory compaction feature, which essentially like takes your used blocks of memory in the heap and then compacts them so they are all together, which leaves a lot of empty heap space to allocate more memory, which prevents bloat because you don't have those like empty chunks of memory that can no longer be used to allocate new memory. And so in 2.7, you have to call a method in order to get your program to do memory compaction. But in 3.0, I believe it's going to be automatic. So Ruby will do that for you, which should hopefully fix a lot of the issues that people are experiencing with memory bloat and memory leaks. And so I hope that's going to be like a big, big step forward for the Ruby language and to kind of like quash some of those, the haters and the disbelievers that, Ruby causes memory bloat.
okay.
So one of the things that most caught my eye, so at the first RubyConf I went to, that was 2015, Matt said, our goal for Ruby 3 is to make it 3 times faster than Ruby 2. And I was like, wow, it's a hell of a claim. And yeah. And so what they've been doing is like incrementally making improvements since 2.0 to 3.0. So it wasn't like when 3.0 is here, it's 3 times faster. It's like by the time we get to 3.0, that's our benchmark was 2.0 to here. And so I'm just happy that incrementally over the last 5 years, it's just gotten better. The thing out of 3.0 I'm most interested in and most scared of at the same time is these, what's the word I'm looking for? So they're essentially introducing a way to declare types in Ruby. And the way that works is, I think it's called RBS. And you write a file that actually goes like, it corresponds to a Ruby file, and you can declare like, my method in this Ruby file, this method should take this type of argument and return this type result. And the idea is that there's several implementations of this that use RBS. One of the biggest ones, actually, I don't know if this one actually uses RBS, but one of the biggest implementations of this like idea of types is a project called Sorbet. And it's actually made by the team at Stripe because they use a lot of Ruby.
Yep.
And yeah, so I'm interested to see that. Not so much that I want all my Ruby programs to be like filled with types. Selfishly, I really want better dev tooling in terms of like when I'm writing code, I would like a little more help with, like, I get jealous of like statically typed languages that I watch their tooling and I'm over here and like it feels like Microsoft Word writing code sometimes. So I'm interested to see if we get any like quality of life improvements out of being able to kind of declare types and see if that can help us write programs a little better.
Declaring the types in a separate file is a novel concept. I've not heard of any language doing that before. Is that why are they taking that approach rather than inline annotations the way like Python or PHP did?
So Sorbet uses inline. Actually, they used to. They may not anymore. No, they don't use inline. Sorry. They use... so the way Sorbet works is it's like above a method, you say like, this is a signature, and you like declare it. So it's not even a comment. Like it's like calling a method above it. I don't know exactly, but if I remember correctly, the reason like the Ruby team for their RBS, they want to do that is so that it felt very much like an opt-in kind of feature because they don't want to enforce types in Ruby. And so by having a separate file, like it keeps, my understanding is it keeps your Ruby code like you'd always write it. And if you want to declare some types, you have a separate file that's like the definition for those. There may be a technical implementation reason that I don't understand because I'm kind of ignorant when it comes to stuff that low level. But yeah, I remember they very much wanted it to be opt-in.
Okay.
It does sound somewhat similar to TypeScript. I want to say TypeScript declarations can be defined in a separate file and imported in what sounds like a similar way to this. So I can imagine that being something that a lot of people are familiar with, that like a pattern for them to kind of build that off of. I can't claim to be the most familiar with TypeScript. It just happens to sound similar.
I'm learning things about multiple languages here. Great.
I included a link to a blog post from the Sorbet team about types in Ruby 3, RBS, and Sorbet. And I think it's a very good, like, here's why Ruby 3 is using RBS. Here's how Sorbet fits into that. There's a couple other ones that I'm not familiar with, a couple of other, like, type tools in Ruby, but.
Okay, and we will definitely get that link added to the show notes so people can follow up on that later.
Yeah, and also for context, RubyConf is generally in November, and so we talked about this all last November, and it's coming up again in 2 weeks. And so if we're a bit like, what's happening in Ruby 3.0? It's because we haven't been hyped about it. That's happening soon. But from what I remember, they also talked about like just new syntax that's going to add more delight and sort of like more sugar on top of what we already get. So I think there's some like pattern matching when it comes to like case, or that's like the Ruby switch statement and stuff like that. There's like new ways to declare methods. So like also new syntax things that people have been requesting.
Okay. So a lot of just minor quality of life improvements that add up.
Yeah.
But it does sound delicious.
Yeah, I like sweet languages.
Yeah.
I'm all for syntactic sugar.
Delightful languages, even.
Yes.
One of the fun things about Ruby is Matt's releases, or the Ruby team releases a new version of Ruby every Christmas Day, and it just feels like a Christmas present every year. Like it's just one of those little things. Like the Ruby community is really special to me, and like it's a very fun community, and it's stuff like that it's just like I wake up on Christmas morning, I watch my kids open presents, and then I download the new version of Ruby. So
it's adult toys.
Yeah, I tell my family, don't worry about getting me anything. I have everything I need on the internet. So.
A present for the kids, present for dad, present for mom. So,
oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. Go.
I was just gonna like echo what Jason said, and I think like maybe going back to what Afote was saying earlier about why should someone learn Ruby as their first language? You know, if they're learning in a boot camp, is it worth it? I think you can't overstate the importance of having a supportive language community. You know, so much of the interaction we do around programming languages is on the internet. It's asking strangers questions like, why isn't this working? And then, you know, it's a really bad experience, especially if you're like a marginalized person in tech. Like it's hard to be a woman and then have someone on the internet be like, you noob, you suck, like stop coding. Right. And the Ruby community is just like not like that at all. I think it just has some really friendly programmers, people who really want to help, and people who see the value in teaching others and making sure that others understand. And so I can't overstate the kindness and support in the Ruby community.
Yeah. Note to everyone: be kind to the noobs. You were one at one point.
Yeah, there's a saying. It's called Minneswan, and it stands for Matt is nice, so we are nice. And that's kind of like the unofficial motto of the community. And it's true. At a RubyConf a couple years ago, Matt's was like, I don't like this because I'm a human and I'm not always nice. So he like changed it to like something about we should still be nice, but please don't model it just after me. I can't live up to it.
I have to respect that. It's really easy for tech communities to take that kind of hero worship too far. So you know, someone in that position pushing back on it, I have to respect.
Yeah, it's I mean, but it is true. He's always been so nice every time. Like I don't even know what to say to him, because like I used this analogy with someone else the other day, but it's like when my kids see Mickey Mouse at Disney World, they like freeze up. That's how I kind of am with Matt, but he's never made it awkward, even though I'm incredibly awkward. So
that's good to hear.
Yeah, he's a really nice guy.
What would you say is still missing in the language? Are there features or libraries, or you know, something like this is a great feature where you need to steal from another language? What would that be?
Pattern matching, all day, every day. That's my favorite. Like we have it some in a new version of Ruby, but it's mostly around like kind of like pattern matching out of like arrays and hashes, things like that. One of the things in Elixir that I just adore is pattern matching argument list. So like you can define the same method like 6 times, but you can pattern match like what its argument list is. Kind of not really like method overloading, but also then you can like pattern match like I expect this argument to be a hash that has this key value in it. And then so like Elixir goes through each function. It's like, oh, this matches, so let's use this function. And I love that because it cuts down on so much conditional logic in methods. Mm-hmm. I want every language to have that. So that's my biggest, like, I would probably just shut up and write Ruby forever if it had that.
There's always Haskell.
That is a statement.
I think my like selfish answer, and it's somewhat related to pattern matching, is and of course I'm forgetting what it's called. Like in JavaScript, when you have, for example, an object and you just want to pull certain keys out of it, you don't have to call like object and they get the key. Looks like Jason might know.
Are you talking about like destructuring?
Yes, thank you. Destructuring in JavaScript. Yeah, that's my like this is not important. I recognize this, but having come from having done any coding in JavaScript and being able to really easily manipulate objects, I would love to be able to do the same with Ruby hashes and arrays. My less selfish answer is I think that like yeah, I can be selfish. My other answer that I think would benefit more people generally is either like a better design on more complicated Ruby concepts or like better documentation. For example, we were talking about Ruby threads earlier. I think that's a feature that like people don't use very often, but like there are some times when it is very useful. And if it was a bit more intuitively designed, or like the documentation was written with beginners in mind. Like I'm trying to explain this concept to a new grad that I'm mentoring at work, and I'm like, oh no, I'm sorry, you're just gonna have to suffer a little bit. So I wish that, much like the rest of the language, those concepts were treated with the same design thinking.
So that's an area that still surprises you, and that's the problem in the syntax?
Yes.
Okay.
Or just like every time having to be like, oh, I don't remember exactly how to use this. So I have to Google it and look through one of these like blog posts from 2010 that that I've read 100 times.
So I do actually think this is a thing we've I think kind of drilled home pretty well over the course of this podcast, but just to summarize it down, if I'm starting a new project, what is the best reason to use Ruby for it? What's the sweet spot for Ruby that's just like, okay, you have to use this over anything else that's out there?
I think I think there are a lot of possible answers. I think one possible answer, and this especially relates to Rails, is if you are building something that is already a solved problem. For example, I was working on an open source project that required a content management system so that some external stakeholders could like edit the data on the website we were building without us having to help them. And I was like, this is going to take 2 weeks. But then I just looked up a content management service, Gem, and I used the Thoughtbot administrate Gem. I built it in 2 hours. They're still using it. And so it's like, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Like if it's already a solved problem, then Rails is the way to go almost always, I think.
Yeah. Allows you to iterate very quickly.
Yeah.
Something Emily said earlier was like honestly one of my favorite things I think I've ever heard about like the Ruby community, and that's like it was something along the lines of, if there's a solved problem, they just want to use that. Like the Ruby community loves solved problems, and like that's very much what Rails is. Like,
yeah,
it's 15 years worth of solved problems in framework form, and like for CRUD apps, like create, read, update, destroy apps, like it's hard to beat. It's the Ruby and Rails community are very, I can't generalize to say the whole community, but there's a big, loud sector of the Rails community that it very much pushes back against like the kind of modern JavaScript, like single page app approach. And so like if you're wanting to build an SPA, it's probably like you could do the Rails API mode, which would pair really nice with. But if you're trying to build it like in a standard Rails app, it may cause some problems. But yeah, I think it's just really well suited for just building web apps. Like there's some, specifically to Rails, there's some things I wish it did a little differently. Like I look at Laravel in the PHP world, like, and drool a lot at some of the features they have, but I very much think Rails is great.
Nice.
I also think if, like, I often find myself saying like, oh, I have to, for whatever reason, like clean up this data that I have to use. And it's going to take me a while if I'm going to do it manually, but it's also going to take me a while to code. And I feel like that's where the programming joy sort of comes in, and the easy to use syntax. If you have a problem that you want to solve quickly and you want really a really easy way to like manipulate files and work with not huge amounts of data, but more data than you want to just like comb through yourself, it's a great language for like quick scripting and and solving problems in ways that you wouldn't want to do on your own.
So they're just a bang out a one-time thing and get it over with type problem.
Yeah, Ruby, like it's so easy to get things done in Ruby.
Yeah. I think that's the thing I take for granted. Like, I think part of like, because of like my obsessive compulsive disorder, I have this like, I have to make things perfect. That's sometimes to a fault. Like the other day I wrote a Ruby script and I was like, don't care, like no best practices, just get it done. And it was really cool. Like it felt really good. So
yeah, that sometimes it's stepping off the track can be fun just for the, like you're violating standards and getting away with it factor. Yeah, I can attest to that. So how about the flip side though? Is there a type of project you look at and go, you know what, I love Ruby, but it is not the right tool here. I'm going to use other thing. What would that be?
I think if you, and this is a generalization, but if you have cases where like, from the outset that performance is going to be a huge issue, I think Ruby and especially Rails, like they're built to create a lot of magic. And in order to strip away that magic and like dive into the parts that are affecting performance, like you really have to know what you're doing. And so I think that might be a case where like Rust or Golang or, one of these other like newer, more performant languages might come in handy. I don't know if you agree with that, Jason.
100%. There's Ruby is like, for me, it's good enough for a lot of use, especially for like the type of web development I do. If I were building an application that needed lots of like simultaneous connections, like over WebSockets or something like that, it's possible in Rails, and we do it at work. But like, there are other languages where that is gonna shine more. Like that's the reason a lot of people in Ruby like Elixir is because it has that like Ruby-ish syntax, but it's built on top of the Beam, right? The Erlang VM. And it can handle these massive amounts of connection, and it uses way less resources overall in those scenarios than say like Ruby and Rails. So there's a project or it's a language called Crystal that's pretty cool.
We actually just had a question from the audience about Crystal, so very well timed. So
very cool.
Play with Crystal for the high performance parts.
I've not used Crystal inside like a web application, but I gave a talk on Crystal once, and one of the examples I gave was like the Fibonacci sequence, right? Like the de facto like how well does it perform? And I took the Ruby script that did it. I copied and pasted it into a file and changed the extension to CR for Crystal. I just had to change a couple of types, or I had to declare a couple of types, and I don't remember the exact thing. It's been a few years, but it performed like 9 or 11 times faster. And I know their goal isn't to be a compiled Ruby. That's not their end goal, but it's very heavily inspired by Ruby to the point where I could literally copy and paste that file. So I think Crystal's really cool. I just haven't played with it enough.
So fill me in here. Crystal is a different language that's Ruby inspired, or
Totally.
is it another engine? What is that?
It's just a completely different language. I think it uses the LLVM.
Okay.
And it very much is inspired by Ruby. You require files, you say things like puts, you define methods the same way, def, method name, argument. And it has meta programming through macros. So it very much if you're a Ruby developer and you just want to hop over and look at Crystal, you'd be like, wait, this isn't Ruby. But it's they're working towards version 1. I don't think it's supported on Windows yet, so it's only Mac and Linux. But there's a couple of really cool frameworks out there for it already too, like web frameworks. So it's very promising.
Interesting.
That's cool. I'm learning a lot from this. I'm gonna go try out all these new things I'm learning about.
All right. Do we have any final thoughts before we close up?
None from me, besides thank you for having us, and also Ruby is awesome and I love the community.
Yeah, that likewise. I love the language, but even if I stopped writing Ruby today, the community would still be a thing I want to be a part of. Because I've made most of the personal connections with friends I've made over the last 5 years have actually been in the Ruby community, going to conferences. Some of the people I talk to every day are friendships that came out of that. So yeah, just on a human level, Ruby is very special to me because of the ecosystem around it.
Me too.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you to both of our guests, Emily and Jason, for talking to us about Ruby. As you mentioned, Ruby does run great on Platform SH, so go ahead and deploy your Ruby on Rails apps or your Sinatra or these other tools we talked about, and get all the benefits of Platform just with your favorite language, Ruby. Do tune in next week. We're going to be talking about, what are we talking about? I think next week we're talking about MySQL, if I have my calendar correct. So switching away from languages for a little while, talk about some of the other tooling that is widely used in the world, including the new versions of MySQL. So if you haven't already, do subscribe to the show on YouTube or Twitch or Periscope. We're streaming on all the things now. And we hope to see you next week. Until then, go ahead and deploy, because Friday is an excellent day to deploy, at least if you're on Platform SH. Take care, everyone.